Please be advised, Once Upon a Crime is a series depicting true crime incidents in South Africa. The content may not be suitable for sensitive listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The views and opinions expressed during Once Upon a Crime is not that of the SABC and Lotus FM.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Once Upon a Crime. My name is Keshav Dass. I'm your host of the Night Cafe on Lotus FM. Today's case is titled The Krugersdorp Cult Murders, and we're joined by Nicole Engelbrecht, who will help us unpack this. Now, today's case really shook South Africa when it came to the public's attention for a few reasons. The number of people killed, of course, horrified people, but the added layers in the crime, the cult-like behavior, the allegations of Satanism, and the types of people involved in committing the crimes is, I think, what really got people talking. The case plays out in Krugersdorp in Gauteng, and although the public would know nothing about it until around 2016, it's believed the so-called mastermind behind the crimes, Cecilia Steyn, was actively manipulating people and perhaps even committing murders as far back as 2008. Cecilia Steyn was in her early 30s, married to a police officer, and had 2 children. That was where her sort of veneer of normality ended. She was incredibly manipulative and claimed that she was fleeing from Satanists who wanted to take her soul because she was a multi-generational witch who had turned her back on the occult. Cecilia used this lie to ingratiate herself into the Christian community of Krugersdorp. She also used this lie to manipulate people into caring for her, claiming that the battle between good and evil that was happening inside of her made her very ill. A group of people she'd managed to draw in took turns taking care of her. One of these women was Ria Groenewald, with whom Cecilia had started a course which she claimed would help save people from Satanism. After several years of caring for Cecilia daily and turning her own personal life upside down for the woman, Ria realized that Cecilia was a fraud and pulled away from her. This resulted in a split between the group that had formed around Cecilia, with some people siding with Ria and the others sticking with Cecilia. Cecilia decided that she needed to seek revenge, and it's at this point, around 2012, that her crimes really started in earnest.
The people that had stuck with Cecilia were quite an interesting group. One of her most adoring sort of devotees was a woman called Nicole Steyn, and the surname is just a coincidence because they weren't related. Miranda was a divorced school teacher, and she had 2 children, Marcel and Leroux. Over the years that she'd known Cecilia, she'd become more and more attached to the woman, and she'd actually moved home several times to move closer and closer to where Cecilia lived in Krugersdorp. And in 2012, she was actually living in the same block of flats as Cecilia Steyn. At one point, she even had her teenage daughter Marcel, living in Cecilia's flat to take care of her. Another one of Cecilia's followers was a man called Zach Valentine and his wife, Michaela. They were a young couple, and Zach was a very successful life insurance salesman. And he was a major financial contributor to Cecilia. So she claimed that she needed money to be able to fend off these Satanists that were coming after her. And she also came up with a story about this orphanage, which allegedly housed the orphans of people who had been murdered by these occult groups. And, she needed money from Zach. He ended up giving millions of rands to her from his salary to fund this so-called orphanage that she spoke about. The last member of the group who would join a little bit later on was a man called John Barnard. And John really joined the group because he had a substance use disorder. He'd used drugs for most of his adult life. And it's believed that John had actually joined the group because at certain stages during the group's formation, Cecilia had actually been selling drugs out of her flat. And John used to buy drugs from Cecilia, and that's how he became involved in this group. By 2012, the group had really sort of solidified, and they actually even had a name. So they called themselves Electus Pedius, which means chosen by God. And many of the members of the group actually had this name tattooed on their bodies. And it's really difficult to say how much of what happened next was their own choice and how much of it was down to Cecilia's manipulation. But for the most part, it seems like the members that I've mentioned of Electus Pedius were already primed for some of the horrendous things that they would do by the time they met Cecilia Steyn, and she really just gave them a shove over the edge, if you will, with her manipulation. So the series of murders committed by Electus Pedius actually spanned quite a few years, and they were divided up into two sections. So the first few murders really seemed to directly result from Cecilia Steyn's desire for vengeance against her ex-friend Ria Groenewald. And that would victimize the group of people who had sided with Ria when she cut ties with Cecilia. And the first two murders that were committed by the group on Cecilia's instruction were those of Natasha Berger and Joy Boonzaier. Cecilia had claimed that Natasha, who was a 33-year-old attorney at the time, was causing the deaths of children in this orphanage by saying certain forbidden prayers. And this quite strange lie seemed to be enough to get Zach Valentine, his wife Michaela, and Marcel Steyn, who was just 14 years old at the time, to agree to kill Natasha. On the 26th of July 2012, the three approached Natasha's 63-year-old neighbor, Joy Boonzaier, and they convinced her to write a note to Natasha. It was Natasha's birthday. So they asked Joy to write a note asking Natasha to come next door to Joy's apartment when she got home because they had a surprise birthday gift for her. So Joy sadly was quite excited about the surprise for Natasha, and she did as they asked. Unfortunately, what happened was as soon as Joy had written that note and they'd pinned it to Natasha's door, Zach killed Joy. He stabbed her to death in her flat, and then they waited in the flat for Natasha to arrive. She arrived after work that day. She saw the note on her door and she came to Joy's apartment, and she was also murdered by Zach Valentine, stabbed to death. The group's next victim was a mentor and a longtime friend of Ria Groenewald, who Cecilia really wanted to hurt. She wanted to kill this individual to hurt Ria as much as she could. And Reg Ben Dixon, who was the victim, was a retired pastor. And this time, Zach, Mirinda, and Marcel went out to commit the crime. They dressed in fake police officer uniforms, and the presence of young Marcel probably put Reg at ease. But Mirinda and Zach turned on him almost immediately as soon as his guard was down, and they actually hacked the man to death with an axe. And this was Mirinda's first murder, and she would later describe it in court in quite terrible terms. She said that it was adrenaline fueled and she found it quite exciting, which was quite a bizarre thing to hear her saying in court. And sadly, Reg's wife stumbled upon his body when she returned from work later in the day. She found him laying in the garden dead. What came to light was that the first murder, Natasha Berger's murder, had actually triggered Zach's wife, Michaela, to want to start to pull away from Cecilia Steyn. She had been quite horrified by the reality of murder, and it really didn't sit well with her, despite all the stories that Cecilia had been telling them about why it was important to commit these murders and they were doing good things. And she started to tell her husband, Zach, that they needed to get away from Cecilia. And Zach actually lied to his wife, and he said he agreed with her and they were going to pull away from Cecilia, but they needed to do so slowly. But what he was actually doing was double-crossing her. And he was far more devoted to Cecilia at that point than he was to his own wife. And when Cecilia heard that Michaela was turning against her, she told Zach that his wife needed to be killed. So a plan was set in motion where Zach would drug his wife, Michaela, in the morning with her morning coffee. And then Marinda and 14-year-old Marcel would enter their townhouse after Zach had left for work, and they would kill Michaela. Marcel, of course, had been present at the first two murders, but she hadn't actually participated yet. And this murder would be the first time that this young girl, led by her mother, would actually help to commit the murder of one of their victims. Both Marcel and Marinda then killed Michaela Valentine through a combination of stabbing her and blunt force injuries while she lay in her bed. Zach had set up a meeting with an estate agent for later that afternoon, and then he sort of set up this stumbling upon his wife's body to try and claim his innocence in the matter. This murder of Michaela Valentine concluded what would be the first phase of the series of murders that was committed by the group. And it would later emerge that police had actually had the group and members of the group on their radar as suspects for these murders. But for various reasons, they never followed through with any arrests. And sadly, this would be a fatal mistake for many more victims, because by 2015, Cecilia was running out of money, and she'd started to shift her modus operandi from revenge killings to murder for financial benefits. In 2015, Zach and Marinda had actually started to ingratiate themselves into the lives of previous employers of John Barnard. He had actually suggested the couple, Joan and Peter Mayer, as their next targets because he claimed that they were very rich and that there were huge amounts of cash hidden all throughout their home. So Zach and Marinda had met with Peter Mayer a few times before the murders actually took place, just to scope out the house and try and settle Peter and make sure that he trusted them. They were essentially, what they were doing was faking being employed by the Department of Trade and Industry, because Peter was a businessman and he was trying to get a new project off the ground. And on the night that the murders actually took place, Marcel had again accompanied Zach and Marinda to the mayor's house, and they attacked and murdered the couple in their home. They actually didn't find any huge haul of cash that John had spoken about, and they ended up leaving the house with less than a few thousand rand. Cecilia decided that they would have to change their tactics slightly because she wasn't happy with the type of money they were getting in from these murders. So they decided that next they were going to actually fake Zach Valentine's death and claim his 3 million rand life insurance that he had on his life. To do this, though, they would need a body that looked similar to his. And sadly, the victim that ended up being killed to achieve this was a young man who was down on his luck and who was just trying to earn some money for him and his heavily pregnant girlfriend. His name was Jared Jackson, and he was strangled to death by Marinda's son, LaRue, with Zach present. And then Jared was placed into Zach's car on a road near Steyn in the Free State, and the car was torched. After this, Zach went into hiding. And this was the first murder that LaRue, who was just 18 years old at the time, was actually directly involved in. Although Cecilia did her best straight after the murder to try and claim the life insurance, the detective on the case and the insurance investigator from Discovery were both very suspicious, and they put everything on hold and refused to pay anything out to her until they had completed their investigation. After this, the rest of the group would start a phase of the series of murders which would be called the appointment murders. And this involved the group, which it was usually Marinda or LaRue, making appointments with tax consultants, insurance brokers, and finally an estate agent. And they would change the appointment venue at the very last minute with these people, so that instead of going to a public place, the victim came to their flat in Krugersdorp. They would then attack the victims, tie them up, and they would get as much money as they could out of their bank accounts with their ATM cards before strangling the victims to death and dumping their bodies. And 4 additional victims were killed in this way. They were Glenn McGregor, Anthony Schofield, Kevin McAlpine, and Hundley Latifan. By the time Hundley was killed, police were finally on the group's trail, and not long after Marcel and LaRue were arrested after being identified through ATM footage. The youngsters did try to play hardball at first, and eventually the detectives managed to discover some information about how LaRue's mom, Marinda, had actually betrayed the children. And when LaRue found this out, he turned against her and agreed to work with the police. So Marinda, LaRue, Cecilia, and John Barnard were all arrested in quick succession after that. And Marinda actually tried to save Cecilia by pleading guilty to all of the murder charges, essentially taking all the responsibility on herself and claiming that Cecilia had known nothing about what they'd done. But this was really to no avail because the evidence proved otherwise. All of the group members were found guilty and they were handed down multiple life sentences. John Barnard passed away in prison recently, and Cecilia Steyn has still been in the news quite frequently even after her being sentenced. She was allegedly trying to arrange hits from prison. She's been caught with contraband, and she's become involved in a relationship with another quite high-profile convicted murderer.
So, Nicole, can you tell us, what do police think the group was doing between 2012 and 2015 when there seemed to be a gap in the murders?
So police did identify quite a few plans that the group had made to kill other individuals during that time. One of the individuals was Ria Kroonewald's son. This was another of the revenge murders that they had planned, but thankfully that plan failed and they were unable to do that. So they know that there were other crimes during this time, and having spoken to the detective that actually ended up cracking this case, he did say to me that they do believe that there are other murders that this group is responsible for. But because they had already managed to snag them with so many life sentences, it really, sadly for the victims, it didn't make sense to use more of the court's resources to add additional life sentences for these additional murders. So we know that they weren't doing nothing during that time. They definitely were committing other crimes.
What were the reasons for them then getting away with the first 4 murders?
I think there's a few. Sadly, with the Satanism element that had been introduced into these murders, Cecilia had really tried to stage these murders in a way that she knew, and we must remember she was the wife of a police officer, she knew would have the police thinking that they could have been occult-related murders. And sadly, this did seem to attract the police's attention and put them on a different sort of trail of investigation for quite some time. And they were looking in all the wrong directions because of these red herrings that she planted. There has also been some disciplinary action taken against a few police officers in this case, where it was proven that some police officers had actually mishandled evidence and possibly even covered up for Cecilia Steyn to ensure that she was not caught with these murders.
Now, Nicole, you did mention that Miranda wanted to take the blame for the murders, but did Cecilia actually commit any murders herself then?
So this is one of the interesting things about this case, and it's very similar to, viewers and listeners might know about the Manson family murders, which was quite a famous case in the 60s in the United States. And Charles Manson was almost a male version of Cecilia Steyn. Neither of them actually committed murder with their own hands, but they were found guilty of murder. And that's, I think, one of the things that makes it so interesting is that, Cecilia Steyn was able to manipulate people to commit murder, and because she was essentially the mastermind behind it, legally she was still, guilty of murder, even though she hadn't actually so-called had any blood on her own hands.
Now, what I find particularly interesting about this case is the supposed link to Satanism. But was there any truth at all to Cecilia's claims about her having been involved in Satanism?
But police could find nothing in her past where she'd actually been involved in any occult type activities. They interviewed her parents, they went back in their school records, they could find absolutely nothing like that. And, really what came to light was this entire course that Cecilia had put together. She'd actually Googled off the internet, and she'd copied and pasted a whole bunch of stuff she found on a whole different, all different sites related to claims about Satanism and different occult practices. And she just copied and pasted it into this book that this course that she made. So there's really no truth to it. And sadly, what it really shows is how she was able to sort of weaponize this fear that runs through a lot of people, because every time we have a case like this come up, we have this sort of wave of satanic panic, which is 9.5 times out of 10, there's nothing to it. And really, it just helps the offender to hide their own actions, because at the end of the day, Cecilia, there was nothing spiritual about this. It wasn't a fight between good and evil. It was Cecilia getting revenge and Cecilia wanting money. And, that was really all it was to it.
Well, that was episode 3 of Once Upon a Crime. You can catch the next episode next week.